Carnegie scientists explore the outermost reaches of space, the mysterious depths of the Earth, and the origins and mechanisms of life. Our scientists are chosen for unique skills and boldness. Their amazing discoveries, spanning more than a century, demonstrate the power of freedom. Carnegie investigators are intrepid adventurers who pursue their goals even as they mentor and train the next generation of scientists. They are free to question, to wonder, to creatively pursue ideas from the vast universe to the subatomic world. We explore the past to understand the present and inform the future.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Matthew Scott. I'm president of the Carnegie Institution for Science. Delighted you came through the cold weather to join us tonight for what's going to be a very special and exciting presentation. When most of us hear the name Darwin, we think of evolution, and that's going to be a primary topic in the next talk in this series by Peter and Rosemary Grant next month, and I hope you'll all be here for that. They're amazing scientists who work in the Galapagos primarily, and you should really hear about their work. But when tonight's speaker, Dr. Ayanna Howard, hears the name Darwin, she has a different frame of reference. She thinks about her robot. The robot Darwin, which is an acronym, this just slips easily off the tongue, Dynamic Anthropomorphic Robot with Intelligence. It's pretty nice. It's a humanoid robot about 18 inches tall. It can walk, speak, and listen, and it can balance on its head, that being the critical property. It can even play soccer. Dr. Howard and her colleagues at the Georgia Institute of Technology are using Darwin to engage and empower disabled children. Now, as a parent, I have to say that I'm a little worried about competing with a robot that has infinite patience. It may set standards that we cannot rise to later, but I guess that's a good problem. Disabled children are among the most marginalized groups in society. They are sometimes excluded from schools and from adequate health care, and they are often ostracized from their peer groups. Robots, Dr. Howard believes, can shatter barriers, providing these children with opportunities that help to level the playing field. Dr. Howard is the Linda J. and Mark C. Smith Endowed Chair in Bioengineering in Georgia Tech School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. She told us earlier that her interest in robotics started in middle school, so she has spent really a lifetime developing her ideas about how to innovate in this field. She is also the founder and director of Georgia Tech's Human Automation Systems Lab, where she does a lot of that work. And before joining the Institute in 2005, she spent 12 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a senior robotics researcher and deputy manager. She earned her BS degree from Brown University, PhD from the University of Southern California, and an MBA from Claremont University, a degree she no doubt found useful when in 2013 she founded Zyrobotics, a company that licenses technology derived from her research. She's currently the company's chief technology officer. In her research, she has made significant contributions not only in robotics, but in artificial intelligence and computer vision. In 2003, she was named by the MIT Technology Review TR100 as one of the top 100 innovators in the world under the age of 35. In 2008, she received worldwide attention for her snowmote robots designed to study the impact of global warming on the Antarctic ice shelves. In 2014, she received an A. Richard Newton ABIE award from the Anita Borg Institute, and a year later, she was recognized by Business Insider as one of the 23 most powerful women engineers in the world. That's a somewhat ambiguous statement, I suppose, but it's all good, no matter how you interpret it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ayanna Howard.
I want to do in this 40 minutes, 45 minutes that I have with you is introduce you into my world. And really it's to inspire you in terms of thinking about robotics in a different way, different than what you might see in the news and out in the media. And so what I do in terms of my focus is really to develop robotics and the technologies that support it to address the diverse needs of children who have diverse abilities. So when I think about a child, every child is unique and every child has their own ability. And so I think about robotics as addressing that. And so to lay the foundation, like most of us were kids at some point, and a lot of us have kids. And so pediatrics is really special to a lot of people. But if you think about disabilities, a lot of times there's this disconnect for a lot of people. Disability might be that it's someone else, or yeah, my sister's friend's daughter had a disability. But the fact is that we all are touched by this word disability. And if you think about it, when we think about robotics, we think about disability, and the classical definition is a change in your normative function. What does that mean? So that means if you are a world-class tennis player, and that is the way you make a living, and then at the ripe old age of, say, 40, maybe you have tennis elbow, or you have a little arthritis, and you still want to play tennis. What do? Well, you have a change in your normative function, i.e., wouldn't it be nice if you had a robotic, say, exoskeleton that can still enable you to play tennis and make a living? And so when we think about disability, we really think about this aspect of a disability, besides just the classical. And the fact is that in countries, and this is a statistic, in countries with life expectancies of greater than 70, such as the United States and Japan and Europe, individuals in this room will spend an average of 7 to 8 years living with a disability. And so it's like, wait, no. So how many of you have problems driving at night? Okay? At 20, you didn't have a problem. Now you have a problem. And so we think about these things. We think about the fact that the world is becoming this touch-based society. And eventually, when you get older at 80 or 90, if it has an issue, you have an issue with your mobility, what happens to your world? How do you interact with the world at that point? You have a disability. And so we think about this world of disability, i.e., how do we enable robots to really allow you to still have the same quality of life, live in your home, have the same expectation of what it is to live. And so we think about disabilities a little bit differently. And when I teach my students, I'm like, guess what? You're designing robots for your own future. And so you really should be invested in this at all times. And so let's go back into classical disabilities and thinking about children who are what we call diagnosed as having a disability, which is different than, say, being older and having a disability. In the world, there are a documented 150 million children with disabilities. And we actually think it's larger than that, because these are documented numbers. So basically, places that have fairly good ways of documenting the numbers, we know that this is much larger, especially in some countries that don't document it correctly. In the United States, $1.6 billion industry in what we call pediatric rehabilitation. This is not special education. This is not the technologies that allow, say, a child who is nonverbal to have a voice. This is just on rehabilitation, $1.6 billion. And so imagine that $1.6 billion for pediatrics, what happens on the other extreme? And this number, there's a lot more older adults than young kids, as we know. So this is really an issue, and we don't have enough healthcare workers to address the disability numbers that we have in terms of rehabilitation. And so what I focus on is really trying to change the space. How do we provide the services that our children deserve in order for them to develop at the rate that they can, based on their own ability? My two demographics primarily that I interact with are children with cerebral palsy palsy. About 1 in a little over 350 children in the United States, so these are US numbers, are born diagnosed with cerebral palsy. I also interact with children with autism, a much larger demographic, but the secondary condition for a number of children with autism is limited fine motor control, so hand-eye coordination. And so those are also some of the children that I interact with. And what we want to do is we want to bring robots in the home environment to really augment the services that they're provided either in the school system or in the clinic. And you can ask any pediatric clinic, any pediatric therapist, what would you like? And they will say, I wish that I could offer my patients, my children, more services because they don't see me enough. And there's reasons for that. Insurance doesn't pay. It might pay for a visit a week, a visit a month. And they are supposed to, kids are supposed to go home and exercise and do their therapy, and guess what happens? They don't, right? And mom and dad will come in and the therapist will say, oh, have you done it? Yes, 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 yes. We've done our therapy, and of course we know they don't. And so we want to augment this. How do we design robotics to do this? One of the challenges is that in the pediatric clinic, it's like a playground. It's very fun, it's engaging. In order to engage a child in something that might be painful, so it's like exercise, it might be painful, you need to engage them where they are. So you need to make it fun and engaging and exciting. And it does have a therapy objective, but it really addresses the child's need. They're very inquisitive, they want to touch, they want hands-on. And so this is what we have to compete with. We have to say, oh, here's this playground, and then we go into the home environment. I'm going to take off my earring because it's clacking. Then we want to go into the home environment. So how do we do this? How do we make this engaging? We can't take this really fun, exciting environment and put it in a box and take it home. So we use robots. So robots are really interesting. I don't have to try. I can bring a robot in. I don't have to say, oh, here's my robot. Would you play? Oh, no, 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 no. Immediately, I bring in a robot. It's like, what is that? What can it do? How can I engage with it? And so we can mimic what you do in the clinical setting in terms of engagement by just bringing in a robot. Now, maybe 20 years from now, when everyone has a robot, this might not be the case. But right now, I bring in a robot, and it's already engaging. It's already exciting. And so we can exploit this natural affinity, this natural I want a robot. This is interesting. I will follow whatever the robot is because it's innovative and it's novel at this point in time. And so we're going to capitalize on that. Now, one of the things that is difficult with kids, all kids are different. So when I started this, I was classically trained as an electrical engineer. I then went into robotics and tried to figure this out. And then later on, I did this human-robot interaction. And, biology I never took anything in healthcare. So I had to learn, and so when I first got into this space, I was working with children with CP, and there's a label. And I would go in and like, oh, we have a child with CP. And I was like, okay, motor disability, I know what that is. And we have a child, and he's like, yeah, this is a scale of 2. And I'm like, okay, what does 2 mean? Okay. Oh, I understand 2. This is a certain movement, so I have a scale of 2. 2 means nothing. I've seen 10 children who are labeled as a scale of 2, and sometimes they come in and maybe they have a slight gait or a slight limp. Another one will come in and maybe they have some aspects of movement in one hand or the other. And every child is different, and the label actually means nothing. The label is basically a code that I can then charge someone. And so this is what we have to deal with. And so as a very early on, a robotic system, I had to figure out how do you make the interaction personalized? How do I, when a child comes in, there is no label. I just interact with a child and I figure out what is it that they need? Where is their movement? Or is it that they have some gait disability or some gait limitations? Or maybe it's upper arm. The robot has to figure that out because the label doesn't mean anything. The other thing I found out is children, like you guys are sitting here very nicely. I don't see any cell phones like with my students. This is an acquired behavior, just so you know. It's acquired. So kids at very young age, in terms of attention, they're very quick, and there's a reason. So if I am growing and my mind is developing, there's so much information about the world that I don't know. And so I want to focus. But when I got it, okay, you're talking, I got it. Let me go to the next thing. And they're designed to really switch. They need to do that in order to learn about the world around them. And so it's not that a child just can't sit still, it's that they're trying to take in the world around them and learn from it. And so what that means is that kids actually get bored very easily. And so I have to deal with that. How do you introduce a robot that is, engaging in minute 1 and minute 5, but 8 weeks later still is engaging to the child? How do I capitalize on that engagement, knowing that the child gets bored? Well, one thing is I have to figure out that the child is bored. And so we do things like that, like think about the robot and figure out how do you identify a bored child. If any of you have been in a preschool classroom, amazing teachers. I mean, they will be able to switch. I'll be like, wait, but you're supposed to be on that lesson for like 35 minutes, right? Oh, no. The kids are about to go into wild mode. I'm like, oh, how do you tell that? So that's what we have with the robotic system, is identifying those types of emotional states and when they're going to transition from engage and disengage, because we have to be where the child is. And so all of that together, we combine it in terms of designing a robot. So this is one of our studies.
My turn. I don't have good memory.
It's an emotional creature.
Your turn.
It engages. It understands language.
That was close. Can I have your turn?
So this is a child who was going through aspects of behavioral therapy, who did not take turns, would not share anything. And what we found is when we had a robot that actually emoted, that was sad when it didn't get its turn, the child wanted to share. Like, I don't like a sad robot.
Is it my turn now?
It's your turn.
Here I go.
I like this. And so we have to have robots
I got it right.
that have emotions. We have the robots that are playmates, that interact in order to engage the child where they are. And so our robots, and some people are like, why do robots have emotions? Our robots mimic emotions in order to engage the child. Why should robots learn? Our robots learn because every child is different, and I have to understand how a child interacts and how a child learns so that my robot can learn in the same way. And so all of these are so that the customization of the therapy protocol is sufficient for that child. And so our system consists of a bunch of different things. So one is we gamify therapy. So we have this robot, there's an interaction, you saw the tablet. So we take where a child is right now, age of 2, every single child is now a tablet smartphone user. Sorry, that's where we are. So we gamify technology. So we have games in terms of putting in the therapy protocol. We have a clinician that can actually say, okay, I want to do something like midline, i.e. here's my midline. I want the child to use one hand and cross, because at some point I want the child to be able to button their shirt. So we're going to just practice that. So a therapist can actually display this. We can codify that in a game, have the child interact, and that's our gamified therapy. Now, for some kids, if they have a severe disability, how do you interact? If I have a severe disability, my range of motion might be very shallow. It might be very, very narrow. Maybe touching a tablet is difficult. So I may have high spasticity, and touching a tablet is very difficult. So we have to incorporate the ability to take whatever their movements. Maybe what I'm doing is I have a child who can move their head. Can I use that as a form of input in order to interact with the therapy games? And then we have the robot that engages and interacts with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these components. So in terms of gamified therapy, we have virtual reality games where you pop the bubbles, and how we engage it. So you can have girls pick princess hats, so we can have different hats. This is a Super Mario. Oh, you're filming this? This is a background with a castle. But you can put on crowns, you can pop different things. So if your favorite thing is a train, you can pop the trains. If your favorite thing is bubbles, you can pop the bubbles. And so we have this system where whatever you enjoy and whatever you want, we actually have this virtual reality game. So that engages the child. And what's nice about our system is that if I have a child who has a large range of motion, the game adapts. If I have a child who has a very narrow range of motion, that's where your objects are. And so what happens is every single child, brother and sister as well, can play the same game. And so now it's not just about a child, oh, I have a disability, this is my special stuff. It's like, no, this is a game that everyone in the family can enjoy. And when you play it, here is your range of motion, and you can pop whatever you want. And when I play it, here's my range of motion, and I can pop. And so what happens is it equalizes this aspect by using games that every child wants. It makes it so that, yeah, it's therapy maybe. No, this is a game. And so that's what we do with the gamified therapy apps. In the tablets, we also do the same thing. And so these are some of our tablet-based games. Most of them use aspects of cause and effect. And so what we have is, let's see if this actually plays. So what we have is these games that allow and use cause and effect. And we do certain things. So some of the therapy is, let's add in some educational concepts. And so not only are we training them in terms of therapy, cause and effect, I need you to touch something, I need you to move, but then we also are training their minds as well. And so we're using the gamification with the therapy, but then they're also having this engagement, which also helps them in terms of the education. And so we use the tablet-based games, we use the virtual reality games in order to engage the child in whatever it is that they want to do. Now, in terms of assistive technology, this was a unique thing. I have a child who might have a severe disability. I have an access point, so maybe I can move my head, maybe I can tap my foot, maybe I can move my little finger. How do we take that information and translate it into movements that can interact with the virtual reality game or the tablet? How do you do that? What does that look like? And it has to be engaging. So like any good scientist, we developed something that didn't work, and that was it. And then we took it out on the road. And we actually went and we talked to parents, and we talked to kids, and we had them try it out. And we talked to Assistive Technology specialists, and we talked to special education teachers. And we came in, it's like, here it is. Isn't it wonderful? And they gave us really, really good feedback, which was good. And so what happened was, through that experience, and now whenever we do research now, before anything is fully developed, we'll do a design, we'll do a little prototype so we have something working, and we will throw it out into the field because we know whatever we thought was good in the lab is not. But you need something. You need something that someone can say something about in order for them to think about that. And so we've learned that over these years about how do you bridge the gap between what we think is great robotics and what really is great robotics, is you bring it into the community at a very early stage, and you admit it's not perfect, and be okay with that. So this was our lessons learned in terms of assistive technology. So we went out, we interviewed a bunch of folks. We then came up with a device that actually allows any child to interact. So here's one of our studies. There's actually a little bitty device right there. So our beautiful glove that took an input, and it was really, really nice, and it won a bunch of design awards, right? It ended up being just this gadget, and what it is an adapter. If I'm in a wheelchair, basically I can take, there's these wires in the back of the wheelchair, I can take the wires out of the wheelchair, plug it into this little device, and now you can interact with tablet games. If I'm in a device where I have my switches in my head, you take those wires, you take them out, plug them into this adapter, and it interacts with the game. If I have a foot switch and I communicate with my foot, you take the wires, you plug it into this adapter, and you interact with these tablet games. So something very functional. And look, oops, you can't even see it. You can't even see it. So, it's very hard to present. Just like, it doesn't, trust me. But one of the things is that it serves a purpose. We heard, we saw, what is it that we need? We needed something that every child, irrespective of their access point, irrespective of their movement, can interact with these tablet games so that the clinician can interact. And then we expand it, because one of the things we found is that you can't see it, right? It's like this little device. And so the kids were like, oh, okay, the clinician was putting it in. And so we were like, oh, we need something a little bit more entertaining, because you have a head switch. And so I want you to push this head switch to interact with the game, and it's like, oh, this is not that exciting. And so we actually took that device and put it into something a little bit playful. So if I have a little thumb, this device, you can actually touch the little stuffed animal with your thumb, and it gives you the same input. You have a foot, you put it on like a pillow, and you can touch it. And so what that became in terms of translating something from the lab into something that was innovative, unique, and
Are you
interesting
looking for new ways to
is
help
a
your
device.
child enjoy math and science? Meet Sumo, a smart toy that makes STEM learning fun and engaging. On the outside, Sumo Turtle may look like a regular stuffed animal. But when children touch Sumo's shell, their math and science apps come alive. From counting games to STEM stories, Sumo and the Sumo Learning System makes math time fun time. With its unique accessible features, Sumo engages your child to learn at their own pace. Empower your child through STEM learning and keep your kids math motivated. Find the Sumo Learning System at sumolearning.com.
So one of the things is like, well, it's a stuffed animal. So again, like with the virtual reality game, you can customize it. So I bring this in. It's an assistive technology device. It's designed for a child with a special need. But guess who wants it? Brother and sister and friends and typical kids. And so now I might have a special need. I might have a disability. But guess what? My friends, they want what I got. And so it empowers a child. You can use it for therapy, you can use it for education, but everyone else wants it. And so now it's about me being special, and I have special abilities, and maybe they're different than my friends and others, but they also want it. And so that's really been the philosophy of my lab and with the robotics, is make it so that it's functional to the diverse needs. And when you do that, it also ensures that every child feels special, whatever their abilities are. So continuing on in this story, the robot. Of course, where's the robot? I haven't shown any robots, right, except at the beginning. So one of the things that in this healthcare world, I will claim I design great robots. But that really doesn't mean anything if the clinician and therapist doesn't get the data that we want. And so very early on, we had to figure out, we introduced this virtual reality system, we introduced these robots into the environment. How does the clinician know that it works? We say it works. No, that's not good enough. And so we went through a lot of details trying to figure out what is the language of outcomes? What is the language in the physical therapy world? When someone improves, what does that mean? Does it mean that they can button up their shirt? That would be nice. But it means more than that. It means that if before I was able to reach at some angle and now I can reach higher, that's an improvement. And maybe I still have difficulties buttoning up my shirt, but this is actually an improvement. And so we had to figure out, how do you provide this information in a way that is understandable and matches to what the clinician is used to? And so we developed a bunch of ways of quantifying movement patterns. And so when we first started this, we had like really, really beautiful math equations. Oh, they were gorgeous. Like, it was awesome. And it meant nothing to the clinician. It was beautiful, though. And so we figured out how you match the mathematics in terms of the kinematic and the structure and what we see as movement, and match it into some of the clinical measures that you have when you have a assessment. And when you're looking at a child and saying, what do they look like? What are their outcomes? We can do the matching. And with that, we have some accuracy within basically 10% error of what we say with our math and what they expect it to say in terms of their outcomes. And so this is great. Of course, I want to get down to like the 1% accuracy, but we're okay at this point because it's useful and it actually matches. And if any physical therapists in the room? Okay, good. Our math is better. So we quantify movements, which was good. So we had this, but you now have to validate it. So you have to validate it. Like, you have these measures. It matches with these clinical measures, we think. But what happens if you have this holy grail? And so the holy grail in the system is typically, I will take markers and I will put them on a person, and then I will go through all of these clinical measures that are the established gold standard. And you have your measures, and we use basically a cheap camera, and we have to compare them. And it's the holy grail, so of course the clinical measures are right. And so we did this, and we looked and we grabbed these two baselines and we did a bunch of studies. So this one is with a sample of 10. And we were able to show that in some cases we were good. So things like the deviation from path and range of motion, we were really, really good. We were like precise in terms of statistically equivalent to what the gold standard was. And other parameters, we weren't. And so one of the nice things I actually value in the clinical world is that you also talk about your mistakes. So in an engineering paper, we'd be like, these are the 3 parameters, and yeah, we didn't even measure the others. In the clinical world, it's about telling the full truth. Like saying this is where it works, but this is also where it doesn't work, because it's really detrimental to repeat those mistakes when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with their health. And so it's disclosing everything and the limitations. It's really different being an engineer and trying to understand why you have to do this. And it's really so that others can reproduce and then they don't make the same mistakes. And so we were good. We're like, okay, at least we understand where we're good and we understand where we're not bad. And these were able-bodied adults. And so, yeah, it works. But we found out something. Kids don't pay attention. They follow no instructions. Oh, it just crashed. They don't follow instructions. And so, you see my screen, my messy screen. They don't follow instructions. This is a problem because, well, it's not a problem. It's not a problem for them. It's a problem for us. And the reason is because kids are going to do what they're going to do. And our system has to work where they are and how they interact. And just because I say this is the way you're supposed to do it, if they don't do it, my system has to deal with that. And so what I'm going to show you, and I'm going to go to my screen, all my messy slides, is that when kids interact, they don't follow instructions. And what I mean is that, like, I tell them, use your dominant hand. It's a game. Well, that's slow. Oh, my measures, you just used the wrong hand. Or, straight arm, use a straight arm. And it's like, well, that's not efficient. I can't get the bubble that fast, so I'm going to use my bent arm. It messes up my data. And so even with that, we were like, oh, this data is going to look like really bad. What we found was that even with kids, our measures were okay. Not perfect, but they actually worked. They gave the clinician the information and the data that they wanted. And of course, because I had to feel good about myself because, it wasn't like perfect, I found studies where they had like human clinicians do this measurement, and the error ranged from like 13 to 66%. And I'm like, hey, we're at like 6%. Even though that's not like ideal, we're like better than human clinicians. No, right? No therapists in here. So this was the case. And so this is good. We can give the measures, we can validate it, it makes sense. And so is it really useful for the rehabilitation? That's really the question. So the outcome measures, that's fine. That's the scientific aspect. But does the system really work? And so we had a study. This was one of our early studies. We had 3 children with cerebral palsy, and we had a set of typically developing children. And what we wanted to see, if they interacted with the system over an 8-week period, would they improve? So remember, there's this personalization. I'm claiming that being personalized is really what's important. Does the system actually work? And so we did this study. It was over 8 weeks, and we took all the measures. And so all the measures, we measured them before they interacted with the system. We measured them 4 weeks in, and then we measured them after to see, I said it works. Does it really work? And so what we found is before the interaction, we took all these measures, path length and movement units and range of motion, and we found that between path length and movement time, so on a number of measures, there was a difference between the children with CP and typical kids. And so the measures said that they were different, that they moved differently, they popped differently, their movement profiles were different. At 4 weeks, what we found was that they improved on 3 of the measures, and they still were different on movement time and movement units. So 4 weeks, okay, this is pretty good. At the end of the 8 weeks, a child with CP interacted with the game, a typical kid interacted with the game, and they moved exactly the same. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. It does work, right? So I'm actually kind of shocked at that point. And so, and like I've learned from my friends, limitations of this study. Children were mild to moderate in terms of their diagnosis. So we did not have, in terms of our studies, our participants, they weren't severe. So this may not work for someone who's more severe. My hypothesis is yes, it will. It just might take longer. It might not be over 8 weeks. It may be 12 weeks. It may be a year. But I truly think that it will work. And we're actually starting to prove that out. Other limitations, because you always have to have limitations. There's like a whole 2 pages when you publish. Do you know this? In the clinical, like whole 2 pages of limitations of why the stuff wasn't exactly right. So another limitation, which we're actually trying to tease out, is the fact that the kids, we have them write down things, they were still going to regular therapy. So the question is, maybe it was their regular therapy. Maybe, because we had to tell their PTs that, we're doing this study so that if there's any issues, maybe if I'm a PT and I'm in the clinic and I know there's this new thing, maybe I work a little bit different with my child. Maybe there's something about the human aspect. We don't know. And so we're also teasing that out. So a bunch of other limitations. But at the end, 8 weeks with my system, and I engaged a child to learn. So this is good. So our games, feasible method, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the robots, because that's kind of why you're here, to see some robots, see some movies. So these are 2 of my robots. So there's Darwin, and this is called RoboJacket, Georgia Tech. And so the types of things that the robot does is it provides feedback as a human clinician, so both corrective, which is, oh, can you move a little faster, straighten your arm, as well as motivational. Great job. I'm frustrated too. That was a little bit hard. So it provides both of this. We do both gait. So if I have a child, and this came out from one of our earlier studies, is if I have a child and I want to do gait, you can either have them kind of walk back and forth over an amount of time. How do you gamify that? You basically play games. You play things like kickball. And so if you think about what kickball is, it's kind of like you kick it and you move and you kick it and you move. And one of our early studies, and why we design these robots to have personalities, we also design our robots to make slight mistakes. In one of our studies, we had this game where there was this kicking back, right? So you kick it, and our robots are perfect, right? So at some instance, there was some error in maybe the carpet, I'm not sure, it wasn't in the robot, and the ball was kicked in an incorrect fashion. So it wasn't kicked toward the child, it was kicked away from the child. And what happened was this child basically lit up. Child then walked to this ball, kind of giggling, and turned and kicked the ball back. And I'm going, that's interesting. And of course, the robot didn't fix the mistake, right? So of course the robot did it again. And the child just laughed and walked over and kicked the ball. And I was like, my gosh, this robot, it's like faulty. And my student is like, I'm not sure what happened. And yet this child was engaged by a robot that was faulty. And so when we started all of these other studies with this robotic system, our robots actually have personalities. Our robots every so often will make quantified mistakes in order to increase the engagement. And we find that when a child sees a robot that has a mistake, they're actually more engaged, i.e., it's hard for me. The robot is perfect, and it's hard for the robot too. It's actually an empowering movement. And so I'm, like now I say, yeah, we make the robots that make mistakes. I mean, this was a lesson learned in the field. And then we have Simon Says, which is a robot that basically Simon Says games, watch me. Our robots have voices. This was probably one of the most irritating ones. Not to the kids, but kind of to the parents. Because if the child didn't do it, it kind of say, come on, come on, come on, right? Very repetitive, because robots are really good at that. So these are kind of our robots that do this. Our robots, again, they make mistakes. They also have emotions. And so these are some of the emotions. Some of it is happiness and excitement, of course. We have this bond. Some of it is sad. So sad would be, oh, we missed that one. That's kind of sad. Confusion is like, I have no idea what's going on. Wow, this is kind of interesting. And what we find is as long as we can recognize the emotion of the child, and match that, we're actually okay. And so we've done studies where we've had mismatch of emotions. So if the child is angry or upset and the robot's like, oh yeah, good job, it does not work, right? And you're like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Of course, it doesn't make sense when you're like coding it up. But what happens is we also recognize and identify the emotional state of the child. And when the robot's emotional state matches that of the child, there's actually an increased bond. There's an increased understanding of this is my partner, this is my playmate, and this robot is going to help me with this protocol, this therapy, this game. Mismatch, not so good. And so yes, our robots have emotions, they mimic emotions because of that fact and because of that need. And so a typical scenario, here's one where we have the robot, we have the child interacting with the game, provides information. We do things in terms of the corrective feedback, the motivational feedback to get the child to engage. And so we run a bunch of these studies over and over and over again in order to show that when you introduce the robot with the correct behaviors and the correct emotional state, you can actually engage these kids in many, many ways in terms of the long term. Now, as an engineer, long term means 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week. So that's long term. But you can engage these kids on a long-term basis. And so, like anything, you have to do a study. Like I said, these robots, they're awesome, they're great. Does it really make a difference? So again, another study. So one of these things about working in this domain is that I can say anything, and I can show that it works with like typically aged adults, which basically means students. And that means nothing to the clinical world. So every time we do something, we actually have to go through the effort of showing that it works with the target population, because that's really the only time it's valued. So this study was with the robot, introduced the robot, and what we wanted to see is if we had this characteristic of a robot with these kind of emotional state, could we get the child to do something that was different? So if I have a child that's moving around, can I have the robot provide guidance to get that child to move to a different state? And we actually did it with movement speed, but we could have done it with range of motion. So movement speed was easy because it's like very easy. Move faster, move slower. So very easy in terms of corrective feedback with the motivational. We had 7 children with CP, 10 typically developing, again, moderate to mild. The age range was still about the same. We interact with typically age 5 to 8 is our kind of our sweet spot. Sometimes we have like 12-year-olds as well. And I love the math. But anyway, we're going to hide that. So after interacting, a couple of things that we saw. So this is typically developing kids. So round 1 is like the baseline. No robot, let's just see what is their natural movements. You know, how do they interact? And we grab that. And then we introduce the robot. The robot, corrective, motivational, again, adapted to each individual child in terms of the range of motions and their emotional state. And I will say, because it was such a short game, emotional state was just like thrilled pretty much the whole time. And then we took away the robot because what we wanted to see is if we took away this feedback, this playmate, just like with a human clinician, the clinician doesn't follow the child around all day. If you took the input away, would these kids still maintain? So they've learned. How much have they learned about this kind of correctiveness? So with typical kids, what we see is that with the robot there, they actually did get better in terms of they followed whatever the robot was said. As soon as you took away the robot, they sort of maintained it, but there was a large deviation. I love these graphs because they always say no one is an average. So this is the average, just so you say. But what was interesting is when we introduced the robot to children with motor disabilities, when the robot was present, they actually performed extremely well as compared to the baseline, as compared to typical kids. And then when you remove the robot, they actually fell further than typical kids. And so this actually surprised, we were trying to figure out why is there a difference? Like, what does this mean? Why is this the case? Why does the robot have a better impact, but then when you take it away, it has a worse impact, is the way we saw it. And so, like any good scientist, you got to go the next level. So you give them paper in surveys so that they can provide their feedback in various ways in interviews. And what we discovered was that so typical kids, even though they aren't really exposed to robots, they are exposed to robots. They have Legos, they have first Lego leagues, they have science camp, and so they really have some exposure to robotics. Kids with special needs and motor disabilities typically do not have that exposure. So Lego robotics, most of them did not have that in an after-school camp because they were going to their clinical services. Having a robot at home and having this special, robot toy typically was not part of their upbringing because they had so many other needs, and that was just a hobby, and that was just extra special, but there was so much else needed. And so when the robot was there, it really was novel. And we believe because of that novelty, that bond was much more impactful. And then when you took the robot away, it also means that they were really pushing themselves when the robot was present. They were pushing themselves. And therefore, when the robot wasn't, it was like, whew, we're done. And so that's what our interviewing techniques have said. What we're now trying to do is actually have quantified methods to validate that, to see, is that really true, or is this just kind of, mom and dad being nice? So we want to really tease that out to see if that's the case. And then, how long do we have to have the robot present for us to then remove the robot and the child still maintain? How long is that in order for it to be present and part of their DNA? But this is really interesting that the robot has such an impact on these kids that it actually makes them push beyond their own abilities. And yes, it's significant. I love that. And so kind of the takeaway of all of that is that robots and children can play together. They can be playmates. They can work together in this unified way of really impacting the lives of children with special needs. And this is our first commercial prototype. So one of the problems that I have as an engineer, as a scientist, is that these robot platforms are very expensive. Right now, I want it in every child's home, and therefore I have to get it to the price point. My holy grail is I get it to the price point of an Xbox. And when I can get there, then I have really changed the concept of robot being for other people. So that's our first prototype, first video. Doesn't quite look like a humanoid, but we're working on it. And then this is some of the impact outside the lab with the company in terms of the licensed stuff, which is the therapy games, the virtual reality games, and its inclusion in the clinical setting outside of the robotics. Because the robotic is still a research platform. It's still us going into the home, but the therapy apps are being used by clinicians in the clinical setting because the apps themselves, again, are personalized, adaptable, based on the needs of the child. And so that's really something that I didn't expect when I started in this domain, because it's my research. It's like I go in and there's the impact, but there's much broader impact on affecting children with special needs. Next steps, I'm pushing forward. I think every child deserves a robot in their home at a price point that's affordable. That's just my philosophy. I'm also concerned, and these are kind of next steps of things with respect to equity and bias. One of the things I find with these robotic systems is that they're smart and they're learning from me, and they're learning my value system, but who's to say my value system is correct? I think it is, but maybe it's not. And so I do worry that as we design these robots for people, we've done studies in terms of trust and people following the directions of the robot, irrespective of what the robot does. This actually worries me a little bit in this space. And so we're thinking about how do we do things on the robotic side as a scientist to ensure that people get the full benefit of these robotic platforms, but that things like bias don't creep into the equation and therefore kind of mess up the positive. So I am concerned about that as well. So these are some of my collaborators, some of my students, and I think it's just so wonderful. I'll leave you with my, so this is one of my newest robots that we're doing the studies. So this is the reward when you do a good job. And then for some of my younger crowd,
Let's move to the next dance.
We think you did a good job, and we have another kind of thanks for you. All right, thanks so much. We have microphones there and there for anyone who would like to pose a question to Dr. Howard or a comment. Maybe we could have the lights up in the room too, please.
Hello, thank you very much. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to interact with Kismet,
oh, yes, yes, in my team.
and the emotional aspect of this is what is so intriguing, and it doesn't just work with children, it works with adults. Now, I was one of the naive participants, right? But when you make a statement or a response, and Kismet says, "I'm sorry you feel that way," and the emotional
sad.
response is, goes along with it. And you're in this conversation, you forget easily that is a robot, and you're interacting with a being who can perceive and respond, and you pretty soon are taking responsibility for that being's response and feelings, and so it really causes you to think about your own person and how you interact with people. Not just, it goes much beyond children.
So that's true. So one of the differences between, say, robotics and, say, an AI agent on a computer is this bond. As an example, there was some videos, this about a year ago, where they had a video of some roboticists basically punching and kicking their robot. And they got so much pushback from this, like this abuse of a robot. And this robot didn't have emotions. It was just a robot. And I think one of the things about robotics is that it is a commentary on our own humanity. I think that's also why it's so fascinating and interesting, but I also think that's why there is so much, I won't say fear, but apprehension about it as well, because it has this dual side. We create robots to have emotions like us, to think like us, to learn like us, and therefore we interact with them like we would someone else. Pros and cons of that. I'm going for the pro.
Yeah, you showed some slides, some kids with cerebral palsy have improved after some time. Are they gross motor or fine motor activities?
These are gross motor.
Gross motor.
These are gross motor.
My second question is, those kids with the autism, they usually lack of communication skills. Are you working on any speech therapy or any of those?
So we're working on behavior therapy. So things like turn taking is one of the big things. We're modeling something called ABA therapy. We're modeling it with the robotic system for behavioral therapy. Not speech, not yet.
Hello. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the child who wasn't good at taking turns, but did so very well with the robot. And then toward the end, you mentioned the bonus of the robot for the special needs kids, more so than the typical kids. I'm a parent. I know in the beginning I was original for my daughter. I was great. She's bored with me now. Longitudinally, how long does that effect seem to last? Does the kid adapt to the robot? The robot is no longer unique in the kid's world, and it doesn't have the same effect.
Yeah, so I have a hypothesis. So we haven't done a long enough study to evaluate how long. But I think about this is that the way we design these robots is as a friend, as a playmate. And frankly, I have my same friend for the last 30-something years. And so I think that because we And they're at my level. Like, my friends are at my level. They understand me. We've grown up together. And so my hypothesis is that as long as our robots can adapt to the child, that'll be just like your friend. How many of you have had friends for over 20 years? Which is different than a parent, which is different than a clinician. It's just a different relationship. So that's just the hypothesis. There is not a long enough study, at least in pediatrics. They have had some with older adults. That's been about 2 years, and it hasn't changed. Like, the interaction was still there. And that was Alzheimer's and dementia. But they showed 2-year study that the interaction was still there.
I was just wondering if you noticed any difference in the special needs children that had siblings versus those that did not.
So believe it or not, all of our kids had siblings. And I don't know if that's a self-selection bias or anything. I don't actually know that. And so I don't know the difference. I do know that the typical kids, in a lot of the cases, wanted to interact with the system. So there was a shared kind of understanding or playing.
I have a question on the Carnegie Facebook page, which was live streaming this talk. It's from a teacher at the Maryland School for the Blind who said she noticed the Perkins School for the Blind was one of your participating entities, and if you could talk a little bit about what the work is that you do with that.
Yeah, so our tablet-based apps, because they are customizable, what happens is that they integrate things like, so with a child, because we also, in previous to the motor therapy, work with children with visual impairments. And so our apps work with students with low sight. So the contrast of a screen can actually be changed. Every one of our tablet cause and effect apps has voice overlays. They're also accessible to things like VoiceOver. And so those kind of things are integrated in terms of the accessibility features of all of our apps and games.
So the question is, as a person from non-science background, so how do you measure growth, especially in a qualifying way? So I have a natural doubt about quantifying methods, and like you create robots to cultivate certain skills, then you measure those skills. It's like self-confirming, like this is how you measure growth. Are there some like other ways? Like there's so much resources and unknown things about autism children. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the way that so I'm an engineer, so everything has to have numbers. So it has to be quantitative. So for all of our studies, we have a baseline, right? And it's something that's measurable. So if you think about turn taking, our baseline is if we introduce a stranger into an environment, count how many times the children actually provided a turn, how many times they gazed at the person, and we quantify that. And then we introduce the robot. We quantify that, and then we take away the robot, because we want to make sure that it's translatable. We bring in a stranger, and we quantify that. And so when we look at these things, we're actually looking at changes and measures of actual behavior of the child. Range of motion, we actually do the measurement baseline with the robot, and then after, and look at those kind of changes. And so it's not necessarily about how a child feels, and we do surveys as well, like quantitative stuff, but it's really about the qualitative, and eventually what we want to do is link it to activities of daily living. So if I have a better range of motion, does it then allow me to do things like brush my teeth a lot better or faster? And so that would be like the next stage after you improve on any of these measures, is the actual activities of daily living.
So obviously, all of these studies are around physical and motor disabilities. And I'm curious because I know there's a lot of overlap with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. So I know that when you said that the age range is around 9 or 10, if that's where their cognitive skills are at as well. So very good question. And so cognitive age of 5 is where we find our system works. And we, because again, at the very beginning, we're like, yeah, everybody come in. And we learned that that's actually very important. And so cognitive age of 5, under that, what happens is understanding
the concept of things like cause and effect diminishes. And you have to understand, if I do something, something happens, and therefore I want to do it again. If I do something, the robot responds, therefore I want to do it again. You have to have that understanding. And so we find that at 5, like really smart for it, but at about 5, that is conclusive, that they understand that cause and effect.
Hi, do you expect that one day maybe government or Congress will say, oh, we need some law or regulation for this kind of robot? And from an inventor point of view, what it should look like for this kind of, like FDA need like a approval for using this kind of.
You saying roles or?
A rule or like a law.
Rules and regulations on robots. So that's actually a conversation that's happening now. It's a conversation that's happening on robotics and AI. Like, should there be rules and regulations about what we should do with this AI and robotics and things like that? And our philosophy, and most roboticists, well, let me not talk about all roboticists. So people who are like-minded, like me, what we believe is that if you put rules and regulations on something that has yet been really invented, you are going to stifle creativity, and you're going to stifle it in ways that are going to be of benefit. I.e., there's other people who are going to do it who are not going to have as pleasant outcomes as we do here. And so that's really what we believe, is that you put the power and the rules and regulations in education, and make sure that our students have ethics training, and make sure our students understand social impact. You don't put it on the research itself. And so it's rethinking about rules and regulations about the people. And I do worry that at some point there might be rules and regulations, and it'll only be the US, and the rest of the world will not. And therefore, all of us scientists will be moving to Europe.
I have a question for you. You can imagine if you wanted to build a robot that's going to be a friend for someone over many years, that the robot has to mature along the way, not only in the sophistication of the games and the complexity, but also the personality would change. Is that something you're working on?
Yes. So our robots do adapt. Right now, they adapt within a limited constraint. We don't want them to adapt beyond the goals of the therapy. But they do learn and they do adapt because, and the reason why is I have a child, and what happens is today I'm in one state of mind, and tomorrow I'm in a different state. And I have to recognize that. Like today, and we call it, today child is having a bad day. The robot has to adapt to that because you still have to do the therapy. And so it adapts in that way. I envision that it can adapt in other ways as long as we cast the problem about how we want it to adapt.
You were very nicely expressing that people might have apprehensions about things like this. And it's really fabulous to hear about this being used in very targeted therapies for children with specific disabilities, you know, emotional and physical. But it's kind of scary to think about this, you know, saying every child should have a robot. You know, as somebody whose children were brokenhearted over a gigapet, this is way back. This is very, very primitive. Children are so vulnerable, and they're so impressionable, and we don't know the long-term effects of everything. People are just worried about how much time kids spend in front of screens now. They don't, you know, people watch cooking shows, but they don't cook things anymore. Right, you know, right. How much physical interaction are we going to get rid of for them to interact with robots instead of unpredictable people, instead of things that they know how they're going to react, or that's everything's so tuned into that child, where they deal with people who don't tune into them the same way this robot is. I'm just nervous about this being a generalized thing rather than a very specific, targeted therapeutic.
Yeah, so if you look at it more general, I claim that because we design robots with these personalities, we can also design them to have like nuances as well, which is so much more powerful than what kids do now with the tablets and the apps, right? Well, but I think, so I claim, and they've done this, robots can actually help teach kids about empathy. A tablet app does not have that same effect. So they've done studies to show if I have an embodiment and I want to show things like empathy, if you have someone and you blow up something on an app, no empathy. If you have a robot and you hurt it, kids actually will feel empathy. But yet, if you think about what's in the mind, it could be the same exact program. And so I think we actually have more of an ability to, because technology is going to go. I mean, that train has long sailed. And so I think robots will allow us to bring back a little bit of the humanity. And it's not because this is human, it's because we think of this as human. That's the difference. We think of it as human. We think of it as a friend. I don't see any teenager going like, this is my friend. You know, this is my, you know, my pal. But yet for the robot, they do use that language. And so I think it's a way that we can actually start changing the way kids interact with technology because the train is going. And I would really like to make sure that as we design new technology, it does make our kids more empathetic and more understanding of social values and humanistic. And I think we can do that with robotics. I truly do.
Thanks. So do you think the robots will rule the world and the world, and if so, will the world be more logical and less irrational?
So one of the comments I always get is, so as people, we're fallible, right? We have our faults. I mean, we still go to war. And yet, if we design robots with really our soul, because we do have social values, but somehow we just throw them out of the window sometimes, right? So if we design these robots to really follow logically the social value, the fear is that one day they'll be like, wait, these humans are violating all of the rules. Why are they in power, right? But I also think if you think about if any of you have kids or parents, sometimes kids especially, they do something that's wrong. And I mean, I would never annihilate my kids because they did something wrong, right? What you do is you help them to understand why they did something wrong. You teach them a little bit better. And so I really believe that if we design the robots right, eventually they'll be like, yeah, these humans are really fallible. But just like we as parents, our grandparents, were like, okay, humans are fallible. Maybe we can do something to actually assist these humans to understand how to be better humans. Imagine that, robots teaching humans how to be better humans. Because they could be pure social values, whereas we have social values with a whole bunch of grays.
Okay, well, thank you for all those good questions and a great evening, and thank you.